Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll begin. The next session is The Other Side of the Hill, and how very fitting it is, because we're in the Wellington Hall, and the other side of the hill was one of the famous maxims of the Iron Duke, who commended soldiers not only to look at the terrain on the other side of the hill, but more appropriately to understand not only where the opponent might be positioned, but perhaps to understand the intentions, strengths, and even the morale of an opponent. But for the Allies, the French and the British on the Western Front, indeed there was a great deal of interest, existential interest into what was lying on the other side of the hill. But for many, it was not the other side of the hill they were worried about, was getting to the top of the hill. If you were a Moroccan soldier in Pétain's 33rd Corps on the 9th of May 1915, looking up to Vimy Ridge and seeing your objective at Hill 140, it was a bloody great hill. And his Canadian counterpart, 23 months later, on the 9th of April 1917, looked at the same bloody great hill and dealt with it. And I think it's very fitting that at this stage of the conference, we now look from the Allies, we look to the Central Powers, and specifically we look at Germany. I'm very privileged here to have two real experts on German strategy and operational methods of the First World War. Dr. Robert Foley from the Joint Service Command Staff College of the King's, and Dr. Matthias Strohn, Senior Lecturer at the War Studies Department at Sandhurst. Both have published widely on the German Army and strategy of the First World War. And I'll ask now, without further ado, for Dr. Robert Foley to start off at the strategic operational level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mungo. And thank you all for coming out today. It's a great privilege to be here today amongst such distinguished company. It's also a great challenge, sort of following such a distinguished panel as the last. So I'm very grateful to be here to be doing this. As Mungo has pointed out, understanding the other side of the hill, I think, is an essential part of understanding the war. If we look primarily at one side, essentially what we're doing is listening to one side of a telephone conversation. We can pick up bits and pieces, but we don't really fully grasp what that conversation is about unless we have some understanding of that other side of the conflict. Now, I face a rather daunting prospect of trying to sort of describe German strategy within about 20 minutes. So there are going to be obvious sort of areas that I'm not going to be able to cover, but I'm happy to sort of take questions about things that in a wider perspective during the question period as well. Now, in the past few years, I've heard a lot about how we in the West don't get strategy, we don't do strategy. Now, there may be some validity to that, but that's certainly something that applies much more to the German army in the First World War than it does to us today. The issue of strategy for the Germans was a real challenge for a variety of reasons that I'm going to go into. I'm going to look at three interlocking problems in this. First, there are structural problems. How do you create strategy if you don't have the institutions to do that? And we touched on this a little bit in the last presentation in Britain. Second, competing strategic visions. How do you reconcile the very different opinions within the senior leadership of an army or a nation? And then finally, how do you get the right people into the jobs? How do you get the people into the jobs so they have the skills, the knowledge to perform? All of these things are difficult issues for all nations in the First World War, but particularly for Germany in the war. I can get this to go forward. There we go. Now, in theory, the Germans had a highly centralized strategic decision-making body. It all sort of came together in the position of the Kaiser, obviously in 1914 held by Wilhelm II. The Kaiser was meant to pull together military advice and civilian advice. And he was meant to use this to synthesize essentially German policy, German strategy during the war. And indeed, the men you can see here are key people in the positions in 1914. Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, the German chancellor, Helmut von Moltke, the younger, the chief of the general staff, and Admiral Hugo von Paul, the chief of the naval staff. But in 1914, this didn't work. The reality was that the Kaiser was unable to play this pivotal role of creating German strategy. He simply didn't have the wherewithal necessary to do this. So this highly centralized German decision-making structure actually broke down. And the reality of it is, it fell to, throughout the course of the war, 4 men. The chief, who were chief of the imperial, or chief of the general staff in the German army. In 1914, that's Helmut von Moltke the Younger at the top of the screen. He was replaced after the Battle of the Marne by Erich von Falkenhayn, who was himself replaced after the failures at Verdun and the Battle of the Somme in 1916 by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who together sort of formed the third Oberste Heeresleitung, or sort of Army High Command. Now, it was these sort of 4 men who really sort of structured German strategy. It was these 4 men who pushed forward sort of different ideas, and indeed they have very different ideas about how to conduct the war. Now, we've heard a bit about sort of German sort of strategic thinking before the war. We've heard about Schlieffen and the Schlieffen Plan, and I'd like to sort of just pause one moment to sort of think about this and think about the assumptions that underlie German strategy in 1914. The first of these, again, we've heard a bit about this, is that it was possible to fight a rapid and decisive victory, and that this rapid and decisive victory would be produced on the battlefield. Now, of course, what sort of follows from this is that the other elements of strategy, as we think of them today, were superfluous. So the Germans didn't, or the head of the German general staff didn't think much about naval power. Britain may have been a potential enemy, but if you could defeat your main opponent on the continent, if you could defeat the French quickly, well, it didn't really matter what Britain did. The naval war would be sort of ironed out in a different way. It also meant, of course, that diplomacy really was meaningless too. There was no sort of sense of, well, how do we sort of go about and create an effective coalition? How do we work together with our existing allies to better our position within the world? How do we deal with neutral states? There's a whole range of issues that were simply beyond the purview of the chiefs of the general staff. Perhaps understandably, given their role as head, in essence, of the German army, rather than a strategic planning. But without an effective strategic planning body above them, what ends up happening is the military sort of elements of strategy came to the fore and dominated over all others within the war as well. Now, part of the other assumptions that derive from this is that Germany simply could not win a long war. Most German sort of observers before 1914 looked at this problem and said, well, there are such problems within sort of German society that as a long war developed and as a long war progressed, that German society would disintegrate. So there is an imperative to have a short war as well. So there's a whole range of factors that are driving people to concentrate on fighting and winning this decisive battle in the field. Now, there's some evidence, at least from German perspective before 1914, that they would be able to do this. The Germans faced a fairly sort of challenging military strategic situation on the eve of war, or between the Franco-German War of 1870 and the Franco-German War of 1914. The French had heavily defended their border with the Germans. And this defensive line would be a challenge to break through, and a challenge to break through quickly. And to win that decisive battle. But there are other possibilities that presented themselves. The French and Belgian border was lightly defended. The Belgian border was also relatively lightly defended against the Germans. Moreover, there's some real advantages to going through Belgium. The road and rail network is superb. So it would allow easy communications with Germany to supply its advancing troops as they wheeled round the French fortifications into the rear, and the soft rear, if you will, of the French enemy. So if you could get the right operational method, if you could just get the timings right, if you could get everybody in the right place at the right time, going in the right direction, there was a belief that it might be possible to win this war quickly and decisively. This is certainly something that Schlieffen felt in 1905 as he drew up his eponymous plan. Moltke the Younger was slightly more ambivalent about this, but still nonetheless stuck with this because it was the best sort of aspect that was out there. Not only did he stick with it, but he strengthened it. In 1912, he rewrote German war plans, dropping an Eastern option and focusing solely on the option in the West. And indeed, he wrote into these plans that even if France didn't go to war with Germany immediately, that a cause would have to be found. So there's this imperative, this drive, that if you can defeat the French quickly, then you can win this war. And there's a belief that the French are effectively the weakest enemy. They had sort of, in German eyes, great divisions within their society that would make them a weak army, and that they would fall apart as the campaign unfolded. So there's a sense we can just about make this happen if all the conditions are right. And indeed, these are reflected in Helmut von Moltke's deployment plans for 1914. Again, as we've heard and as we've seen on the map, a relatively small army deployed to the east, about 200,000 men. The vast bulk of the German army deployed in the west, in 7 armies, in 1.3 million men, there to defeat the French. The main sort of effort of this was to come through the armies of the right wing, outflanking the French fortress line, and striking deep into the French rear. Moltke also hedged his bet a bit and sort of put forward the idea of an encirclement, that actually it might just be possible to defeat the French army in Alsace-Lorraine as well, and hence create a double victory. So there's a bit of optimism on his part. The East was to be an active defense. In essence, the Eighth Army there was to keep the Russians at bay as long as possible, so that the French in the West could be defeated decisively, and then, if need be, troops could be shifted back from the western frontier to the eastern front. So this is a very subsidiary role in the deployment plans of 1914 for the East, but nonetheless an important one. It was supposed to be a very, very active defense. Now, of course, we know that this failed. This was beyond the capabilities of the German army. We heard about sort of the challenges of marching, and this is very real. The large numbers of reservists incorporated into the army sort of wore out quite quickly, and ended up sort of not being at their full sort of capability at the Battle of the Marne. So in the wake of the Battle of the Marne, a very sort of shaken, if not broken, Moltke the Younger was replaced by Erich von Falkenhayn. Now, Falkenhayn, I think, is one of the most sort of interesting, if not the most unique, sort of people within the war. He very quickly realized that the war couldn't be won in the sort of very traditional German method of rapid, decisive battlefield victory. He believed that the alliance would have to be split, and that there would have to be a diplomatic solution to the war, probably a peace that didn't achieve all of sort of Germany's wildest aims. But he faced this very real question of where to concentrate his efforts. Do you concentrate on the east with the Russians, who proved themselves to be a less capable operational sort of enemy, or concentrate on the west, where Germany's main enemies really lie? So there's this challenge sort of within the sort of German leadership. Falkenhayn was very much convinced that the war would have to be won in the west. That's where Germany's main enemies lie. That the German armies in the East would simply get bogged down and would be unable to effect a meaningful victory or a meaningful blow on the Russians. He was forced by circumstances in 1915 to send reserves to the East, and he tried to implement his ideas of cooperating with the civilian leadership in order to bring the Russians into some type of separate peace. In 1915, the Russian army was all but crushed in a series of Austro-German offensives, and Falkenhayn believed this was an ideal opportunity to put out peace feelers to Russia and to try to knock Russia from the war and to be able to concentrate his forces in the West. Now, whether that was possible or not is a rather open question. It certainly didn't succeed, and Falkenhayn certainly didn't get the cooperation he expected and hoped for from the Foreign Office. So Falkenhayn rethought his ideas about sort of how he wanted to approach the war. And this really culminates in this Battle of Verdun in 1916. Now, we see Verdun today really for what it was, this long attritional slog where hundreds of thousands of Germans and Frenchmen were ground down in the Meuse mill, or the Hell of Verdun, as it was known by both sides at the time. Falkenhayn, I think, developed a very innovative, if gruesome, sort of approach to this battle. What Falkenhayn wanted to do was use what he saw as German tactical and operational strengths and apply them against French strategic weakness. So he identified the sort of French manpower as being the sort of political sticking point for France. And if he could put enough pressure on this French manpower, in other words, kill off or wound as much of this as possible, that in turn the French population would put pressure on their own politicians to end the war. So he's really trying to achieve strategic effect with tactical means. So I think this is quite an innovative approach. This is a different approach to attrition than is applied by the Allies during the war, and perhaps we'll have an opportunity to discuss that a bit later as well. Falkenhayn, of course, overestimated German tactical and operational abilities, and more importantly, perhaps, he underestimated French resolve. Verdun ends up backfiring for Falkenhayn. It's a strategic success for the French because they're able to sort of halt this German offensive, albeit at tremendous cost, and at the same time participate in the Somme offensive later in 1916 as well. And this combination of the pressures of Verdun, the Somme, Brusilov offensive on the Eastern Front, and the entry of Romania in the war in August 1916 finally sort of led to the fall of Falkenhayn and his replacement by his great sort of strategic rivals, the combination of Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. Hindenburg and Ludendorff really had a very sort of traditional sort of view of warfare in many respects. They believed that a decisive battlefield victory was still possible. Again, they needed to get the conditions just right, but if you could get those conditions right, get the tactics, get the men, get the material, that you could fight and win a decisive battle in the war. Now, what these two men came in and did was effectively radicalize German strategy. I use that term very deliberately. What they did was they stepped into what they saw as a vacuum within German strategic leadership, even more so than Falkenhayn was able to do. So they stepped into German industrial policy. They stepped into German diplomacy. They stepped into a whole range of areas that should have been fulfilled by German civilians. Now, again, we can discuss why that is. There are problems with the structure of German governance, and we've heard a bit about that. A dysfunctional state that is unable to sort of to put sort of the right people in the right places. They believe they had no other sort of choice within this. They also had a range of other sort of ideas that are important for us today. They believed that weapons should take the place of men. They looked at the sort of the manpower balance and said, "Look, we can't win this. We can't win an attritional war. We've got to focus on sort of using weapons to replace the blood of our own soldiers." They also, coming from the East, sort of had a different view on how the war should be prosecuted. One first in the East, where they saw this weak Russian enemy, and then move forces to the West as well. So the polar opposite in many respects of Falkenhayn. Now, they introduced in August 1916, upon taking sort of command, the Hindenburg Program. This is a massive sort of increase in German industrialization to triple the production of artillery, triple the production of machine guns, and double the output of munitions. They succeeded in this. There were problems along the way. It took a while to get this moving, and it was horribly inefficient. And that's one of the key aspects I want to come back to. They did this by removing manpower from the armies to put in the factories. So they were able to increase the numbers of guns and munitions, but it came at a cost of the field armies that, again, we'll reflect on a little bit later. They also sort of took the decision on naval advice to launch unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917. Now, we all know the consequences of this, American entry into the war. But again, there's this sort of assumption that the enemy could be defeated relatively easily. The Navy had drawn up some lengthy memoranda that looked at the statistics and supposedly proved that Britain could be knocked out of the war within 5 months. If you reduce her tonnage of her shipping by 39%, that Britain would be unable to feed its population and would capitulate in the face of this unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans exceeded their sinking targets by quite considerable numbers at different points over 1917, but obviously Britain was able to adjust its economy, was able to make up the differences in lost shipping through a whole range of ways. And Britain was able to continue in the war, obviously. So this misfired for Hindenburg and Ludendorff. And in fact, what you merely gain is U.S. entry into the war. That in 1917 isn't a decisive factor, but played an increasingly important factor as the war wore on. So they turned back to the battlefield, somewhere they felt more comfortable. They believed that they could succeed, and we all know in March 1918 launched a series of offensives designed to knock the enemy from the war. They believed that new tactics and new operational techniques, and indeed what they felt was the sort of innate superiority of the German army in operational war of maneuver, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this in a bit, would enable them to win on the battlefield in a traditional way. And again, terms that we've heard before, Sedan, Königgrätz, these traditional sort of ideas could have sort of come to the fore again. Again, this fails. They don't succeed in this battlefield victory, and indeed it came at a horrible cost. Looking at the losses of German manpower, this is lost from March 1918 to July 31st. So really, before the sort of major Allied sort of counteroffensives, the Germans had lost a total of 653,000 men. A massive number of men that they'd lost from their field armies. Now, this is, of course, the younger, trained manpower that's very hard to replace as well, and particularly sort of fit manpower. At the same time, you can see this sort of second set of figures there. They had a huge number of men who were fit for active duty. It's the KV there. 1.1 million men in the factories who could have been used within the armies. These were men that were producing arms. Now, again, hugely important. But here you see the real imbalance. In October 1918, the very sort of end of the war, the German High Command had 725 munition trains waiting in its reserve. They fired off about 300 worth of trains in the March 1918 offensives. So a massive sort of number reserve of munitions, plus they had another 500 trains worth at home. In November 1918, the German army counted 11,000 artillery pieces, field artillery pieces. They didn't have the manpower to man them. They were down to 2 men per gun in many respects, out of what should have been a team of 5. At the same time, they had 6,000 sort of guns in reserve at home. So this manpower balance was really off, and came at this crucial period for the German army, unable to sort of match together their industrial production and their operational terms. They're unable to replace the losses that they suffered in 1918. So I think what we've seen, just to sort of pull this all together and to finish up, these sort of range of problems that we have here, this lack of cross-governmental organizations to coordinate strategy at the upper levels, these challenge of competing strategic visions, so a lack of sort of real direction within the army, and army officers who were put into roles that quite simply they were unsuited to do. So army was put in charge of industrial policy, something that they didn't understand. And this had sort of dire consequences for Germany come 1918. And I think I'll end those things there. I'm being told that I'm running low on time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.